Hey, and welcome to the first short lecture from Chapter 7 in your textbook. In this lecture, I want to tell you a little bit about nonverbal communication. So, scientists suggest that up to 93% of the affective impact or the emotional impact of a message comes from nonverbal cues. So, when we're talking, we display all kinds of nonverbal feedback when people are speaking to us. That is, we show facial expressions, body language, etc. Right? That lets people know how we feel about the messages that they're sharing with us. Also, when we're sending messages ourselves, we do all kinds of things. We point our finger for emphasis. We might bang on the table so that people pay attention to what we have to say. We might smile when we say something, or wink at someone, right? All these are forms of nonverbal expression, and they really impact the emotion that comes with different messages. So when we're talking about nonverbal communication, then, we're simply talking about messages that are expressed by non-linguistic means. In other words, we're not expressing what we mean using language, right? Now, this doesn't mean that nonverbal language doesn't involve the voice. It does. Oftentimes, we convey messages with things like sighs, laughter, and the like. And then when we do speak to convey our messages, there are elements like volume, rate, how quickly we speak, the pitch of our speech. All these things influence the message. So, we're all familiar with the idea that we could say the same words in different ways to convey different meanings, right? So if you're really impressed by something, you might say, oh, cool, right? Or if you're not impressed at all, you might go, yeah, cool, right? So we're saying the same thing, but it's really about the pitch and about the way that I say it. So nonverbal communication, beyond that, of course, also includes things like physical appearance, the environment that we're in, how far away or how close we are to the person we're talking to, our body language, the kind of gestures that we use, whether or not we're making eye contact, what kind of facial expressions we have at the moment that we're saying something, right, or receiving a message. All these things influence and impact our ability to communicate and influence meaning. Now, what we find in general is that nonverbal encoding and decoding skills, the ability to make sense of all these nonverbal elements, are a really good predictor of things like popularity, attractiveness, and socio-emotional well-being. So in other words, if you're really good at reading these kinds of nonverbal cues, chances are you're popular, people think that you're attractive, and generally you're probably pretty well off socially, right? You probably have a lot of friends. You probably have a high emotional intelligence. We also find that people who are good with nonverbal communication are also more persuasive. So if you're good at speaking or communicating rather without speaking, then chances are you're probably able to persuade people to see things your way. This is, of course, a major part of emotional intelligence. So being able to pick up on these kinds of signs often helps you in your relationships with others, right? If we could tell that someone else is upset, if we can gain that insight through nonverbal cues, that helps us relate to that person, right? All this has led many contemporary communication scholars to suggest that it's impossible to study spoken language without paying attention to the nonverbal components. So in other words, just looking at words themselves really isn't enough if you want to have a holistic view of the way people really communicate. If we're going to look at communication in its totality, we have to look at how those words are spoken and all the nonverbal signs that go with them. Now, along those lines, I've been telling you all semester, and your book has indicated, that all behavior communicates a message. We're always communicating, whether we like to realize it or not. Even if we're trying not to communicate, we are communicating. You can't shut it off. People are like transmitters. We're constantly putting out messages, whether we intend to or not, and those messages are being decoded constantly by other people who are in our presence. Indeed, when we did a test and we told a bunch of people not to communicate, right? So just try not to communicate anything. And then we asked other people what they thought of those folks who were trying not to communicate. They said they were dull. They said they were withdrawn, uneasy, aloof, meaning they were stuck on themselves, stuck up, deceptive, and a whole bunch of other really, really kind of bad descriptors. So you see that even when we try not to say anything, quote unquote, we're saying a lot. So as a result, we need to realize that nonverbal communication is both intentional, we do it on purpose, and unintentional. So in the unintentional cases, we're sending messages without trying to. Now, some theorists suggest that unintentional nonverbal communication shouldn't be considered. And if we were in a normal classroom environment, I'd ask you what you think. Is it right to study unintentional kinds of messages? This, of course, is a tricky question, and it has to do with the notion of illocutionary force, which is something that I brought up previously in other short lectures. But the notion behind illocutionary force is, the illocutionary force of the statement, for lack of a better term, is what you really mean when you say something, right? And that matters more than the actual content of what you're saying, right? So as a result, then we have to ask: is it, should we study messages when there is no evident intentional illocutionary force behind them? In short, I think we probably should, although it's a dangerous topic because we can, in such situations, get into attribution bias, which we've talked about already, where we establish motives for other people's behaviors that may or may not be accurate. So we find that nonverbal communication usually expresses relational rather than content messages. So in other words, when we communicate nonverbally, it's usually about our relationship to the person that we're communicating with, rather than really focusing on any kind of content. We know, for example, that nonverbal communication plays a really key role in impression management. So oftentimes, if you're interested in meeting someone, for example, at a party, you might make eye contact or smile at them, right? And this is a nonverbal way of indicating interest in another person. And feels much more natural, in fact, than something like going up to someone and saying, "Hey, how you doing? I'm smart, attractive, and easygoing," right? It's that would be awkward. But trying to convey that through body language somehow seems easier to us and is perhaps decoded in a way that's more favorable. So what we find then is that nonverbal communication both reflects and shapes the relationships that we have with other people. So what that means, of course, is if you have a good, warm kind of friendship or romantic relationship with someone, then your nonverbal communication with them is going to reflect that. You're probably much more likely to touch one another, might hold hands, right? Might express yourselves nonverbally in a more open kind of fashion, right? The opposite could be said, of course, if your relationship with someone is already negative, right? You might be more standoffish. You might not confront them as openly or as directly, right? So, again, nonverbal relationships reflect and shape the relationships that we have with others. So you can think about the ways that you greet people, for example. There are all different kinds of levels of greetings, right? From the simple smile or the handshake to the big hug, right? And these reflect in a way the relationship that we have with people when we meet them. If we're meeting someone for the first time and we don't really know them, we might smile and shake their hand. Whereas if this is someone that's part of our family or someone we've known for a long time and been friends with, maybe they get the big hug, right? Maybe not in the COVID era, but more traditionally speaking, maybe this is the way that we greet them, right? So in greeting them that way, the greeting itself reflects the nature of your relationship with them, but it also helps to shape that relationship and perpetuate that closeness, right? To keep it going. So body language, of course, can also signal standoffishness or bad feelings, right? There are flows of power. There are power dynamics that go on behind nonverbal interactions, and the police might provide a useful example. You know, for example, perhaps through experience, when a policeman comes up to your car, he or she stands really tall, puts their hand on their gun, right, and is generally attempting to present themselves in an authoritative manner, right? I mean, what they're communicating is, don't mess with me, or else you might get hurt, right? And they do this because it's part of their training, right? The idea is very much to intimidate you, and that is, in fact, what they're taught to do for the sole purpose of intimidating you, which is part of the reason that policing is perhaps something in need of reform. All right, so we also find that nonverbal communication is better suited to expression of attitudes and feelings rather than ideas. So, for example, if you're thinking about this, you could see that it's much easier to convey the notion that you're sad, for example, non-verbally, than it would be to let somebody know, hey, it's my birthday. Like, how would you tell someone it's your birthday non-verbally? It's really hard, right? I mean, I'd venture to say it's probably impossible. But you could let somebody know you're sad pretty easily, right? Just mimic crying. Or you could let somebody know you're angry at them just by wrinkling your brow or baring your teeth at them, right? But you certainly couldn't let somebody know as easily in a nonverbal fashion that you think abortion is wrong, right? So there are a bunch of things that nonverbal messages can't convey. They can't convey simple facts, past or future tense, right? You can't talk about the past non-verbally. And I say talk just because I default to that. But you can't communicate about the past non-verbally or the future non-verbally. An imaginary idea is really hard to talk about, really hard to communicate about non-verbally. So, for example, how would you communicate about a mermaid non-verbally? Conditional statements are also difficult to communicate, if not impossible to communicate about non-verbally. If you do this, I'll do that. Right? These kinds of abstract concepts are difficult, if not impossible, to express without using language, right? Without using words. And so words, this is where their power comes in a sense, but it's important to realize that words themselves then are augmented and really greatly affected by nonverbal factors like pitch, tone, body language, facial expression, and so on. All right, well, that's it for the first part of the nonverbal communication short lecture, and we'll continue this in the next one. Thanks for checking this out.